Rain drums against the courthouse windows as Judge Michael Bennett adjusts his bow tie, a ritual he's performed for 8 years. The antique grandfather clock in his chamber shows 8:45 a.m., exactly 15 minutes before his first session begins, just as he prefers it. A coffee stain on his morning newspaper has already soured his mood, spreading across the headline about the city's latest diversity initiative. "Another waste of taxpayer money," he mutters, tossing the paper into his mahogany waste bin. The sound echoes in his wood-paneled chambers, a space he's cultivated to project authority. From the leather-bound law books lining the walls to the imposing oak desk, a family heirloom passed down through 3 generations of lawyers. Sarah Chin, his clerk of 6 years, appears at his door with today's docket. Her efficiency is one of the reasons he keeps her around, though he occasionally makes comments about being progressive in his hiring choices. "Judge Bennett, we have 17 cases this morning." The highlight, she pauses, knowing his particular peeves, is a parking violation from the downtown festival last week. Emergency vehicle zone. Bennett's jaw tightens. If there's one thing he prides himself on, it's maintaining order in his jurisdiction. Last week's arts festival had brought chaos to their quiet suburban courthouse's district, and he'd made his position clear. No leniency for those who thought they were above the law. Through the window, he watches the morning crowd trickling into the courthouse. The rain has turned the brick pathway into a warren of puddles and hurrying feet. A woman in a charcoal gray suit catches his eye as she navigates the wet steps with remarkable poise, her leather portfolio held protectively against her chest. Something about her demeanor, a certain confidence that borders on what he perceives as arrogance, makes him frown. "Judge?" Sarah's voice pulls him back. "They're ready for you." Bennett straightens his robes, another ritual. In the small bathroom adjacent to his chambers, he studies his reflection. Silver hair meticulously combed, bow tie perfectly centered, the lines around his mouth deep from years of maintaining what he considers a properly judicial expression. At 52, he's earned his place here, started from his father's law firm, worked his way up, paid his dues. Nobody handed him anything. At least, that's what he tells himself. The walk to his courtroom is exactly 27 steps. He counts them every morning, finding comfort in the routine. The portrait gallery along the corridor shows his predecessors, a long line of stern-faced men who shared his complexion, and he assumes his values. At the end hangs his own portrait, added 2 years ago. He allows himself a small smile at the sight. The heavy doors of courtroom 3 await him. Through the thick wood, he can hear the shuffle of feet, the murmur of voices, the occasional cough. His domain, his theater of justice. Sarah hands him the day's files, color-coded and annotated just as he likes them. The red tab marking the emergency zone violation stands out. 10 minutes with each case should do it, he says, more to himself than to Sarah. We'll make examples where necessary. The festival had strained community resources, and he's determined to remind people that actions have consequences. The bailiff's voice rings out clear and strong. All rise. The court of the 3rd District is now in session, the Honorable Judge Michael Bennett presiding. As Bennett ascends to his bench, he feels the familiar surge of authority. Down below, the morning's defendants rise to their feet. His gaze sweeps across them, pausing briefly on the woman in the charcoal suit, the same one he'd seen outside. She meets his eyes with a directness that he finds unsettling. He settles into his chair, adjusts his microphone, and nods to the bailiff. Another day of maintaining order, of ensuring respect for the law. Little does he know, this routine Tuesday is about to become anything but ordinary. The courtroom settles into its familiar rhythm as Judge Bennett works through his morning cases. Traffic violations, minor disputes, each dispatched with practiced efficiency and what he considers appropriate sternness. His reputation for being tough but fair, at least in his own estimation, has preceded him for years. Dr. Samantha Richardson observes from the gallery's 3rd row, her Harvard-trained mind cataloging every interaction. Her monthly incognito evaluations usually pass without incident, but something about Bennett's courtroom sets off warning bells. She watches him sentence a young Hispanic man to the maximum fine for a rolling stop, while the previous case, a white businessman with 3 prior violations, received only a warning. Docket number 47. Sarah Chen announces, Dr. Samantha Richardson, parking violation in an emergency vehicle zone. As Richardson approaches the podium, she feels the weight of her Supreme Court Chief Justice badge in her portfolio. For 4 years, she's conducted these undercover evaluations, believing that true character reveals itself when people think no one important is watching. Her heels click softly against the worn courthouse carpet, 4 steps to the defendant's position. Ms. Richardson, Bennett begins, emphasizing the Ms. with subtle condescension, not bothering to use her professional title listed in the citation. He barely glances at her as he shuffles through the papers, missing the slight arch of her eyebrow at his deliberate diminishment. Your Honor, she responds, her voice carrying the quiet authority that usually commands the state's highest court. I can explain the circumstances off. The circumstances, Bennett interrupts, finally looking up, are quite clear. You parked in an emergency vehicle zone during a public event. Do you consider your convenience more important than emergency response times? A murmur ripples through the courtroom. Dr. Richardson maintains her composure, though her fingers tighten slightly around her portfolio. Through the tall windows, sunlight breaks through the morning rain, casting irregular shadows across Bennett's bench. Your Honor, if I may explain, she continues, her tone measured. A nurse at Children's Memorial had called about a child's critical medication that was left. Ms. Richardson, Bennett interrupts again, leaning forward. I've heard every excuse imaginable in this courtroom. Yours, while creative, doesn't change the fact that you violated a clearly posted restriction. Sarah Chen shifts uncomfortably at her desk, noticing something familiar in Richardson's bearing. Something that doesn't quite fit with the judge's dismissive treatment. The bailiff, too, seems to sense something amiss, his usual stoic expression wavering. The citation notes you were parked there for 17 minutes. Bennett continues, his voice taking on the lecturing tone he reserves for those he believes need a lesson in civic responsibility. That's 17 minutes when an emergency vehicle might have needed that space. In fact, Dr. Richardson watches him, her analytical mind noting every micro-expression, every tonal shift. In her 20-year journey from civil rights attorney to the state's highest judicial position, she's encountered countless Judge Bennetts. Men so comfortable in their authority they've forgotten to question their own biases. Your Honor, she tries one final time. If you'll review the supporting documentation, you'll see that I immediately contacted hospital security and... Ms. Richardson, Bennett's voice carries a finality that silences the courtroom. Perhaps where you come from, emergency vehicles are less important than your social engagements, but in my courtroom, we take public safety seriously. The maximum fine of $500 should help you remember that in the future. A heavy silence falls. Dr. Richardson maintains eye contact with Bennett for one measured moment, long enough to make him slightly uncomfortable, though he doesn't understand why. She reaches into her portfolio, not for her Supreme Court identification, but for her checkbook. Very well, Your Honor, she says quietly, her voice carrying a weight Bennett completely misses. I trust tomorrow's judiciary conference will be equally illuminating. Bennett, already turning to his next case, barely registers her words. Sarah Chen, however, freezes in her seat, suddenly connecting the dots. She glances frantically between Richardson and her oblivious employer, understanding dawning in her eyes. As Dr. Richardson signs the check with her full title, a detail that won't be noticed until much later, she allows herself a small smile. Sometimes, she reflects, the most powerful lessons come disguised as ordinary moments. Ms. Richardson, Bennett emphasizes the honorific again, his voice carrying the weight of practiced authority. Perhaps where you come from, emergency vehicles are less important than your social engagements. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting harsh shadows across his stern features. In the gallery, a few regular courthouse observers leaned forward, sensing the tension building in the air. Dr. Richardson's fingers traced the embossed edge of her Supreme Court badge, hidden within her portfolio. 20 years of legal experience has taught her the value of timing, of knowing when to reveal one's hand. Today isn't about her position. It's about something far more important. "Your Honor," she responds, her Harvard-educated diction crisp and clear. "I understand the seriousness of parking violations in emergency zones. However, as I attempted to explain, there was a child in the hospital. We're not here to discuss hypothetical children." Bennett cuts in, his patience wearing visibly thin. From her desk, Sarah Chen watches the exchange with growing unease, her pen hovering motionless above her notepad. The young clerk has seen enough high-ranking legal professionals to recognize the subtle markers of authority in Dr. Richardson's bearing. The courtroom's ancient heating system kicks in with a groan, underlining the tension. Through the tall windows, the morning rain has given way to weak sunlight that does little to warm the proceedings. A police officer entering for a later case pauses at the back of the room, catching the charged atmosphere. "The fine will be $500, Bennett declares, already reaching for the next case file. "Maximum penalty, given your obvious disregard for public safety," and he pauses for effect. "Your apparent need for a lesson in civic responsibility." Dr. Richardson maintains her composure, though decades of experience in law allow her to catalog every procedural misstep, every assumption, every subtle indicator of bias in Bennett's handling of her case. She opens her portfolio, deliberately angling it so the gold Supreme Court seal remains hidden from view. "I'll pay the fine now, Your Honor," she says, her tone carrying a weight that makes Sarah Chen sink lower in her seat. The clerk has just remembered where she's seen Dr. Richardson before, on the cover of last month's State Bar Journal. As Richardson writes the check, Bennett allows himself a small, satisfied smile. These are the moments he lives for, teaching what he considers valuable lessons to those who think themselves above the law. He barely notices when she signs her name with her full title and credentials. "You know, Your Honor," Dr. Richardson says as she places the check on the clerk's desk, "I find it interesting that in the cases I've observed this morning, there seems to be a pattern in how maximum penalties are applied." Her voice carries just enough authority to make Bennett look up from his papers. "Do you have something else to add, Ms. Richardson?" Bennett asks, irritation creeping into his voice. The courtroom holds its breath. "Only that I look forward to discussing patterns of judicial discretion at tomorrow's State Judiciary Conference," she replies smoothly. "I believe that's still on your schedule." For the first time that morning, uncertainty flickers across Bennett's face. Something in her tone, in her mention of the conference, triggers a warning bell he can't quite place. But his pride wins out, and he waved her away with a dismissive gesture. "Next case," he calls out, already forgetting the interaction that will soon upend his professional world. As Dr. Richardson gathers her belongings, her movement full of the grace that comes with genuine authority, she catches Sarah Chen's panicked expression. The clerk has finally made the connection, her face draining of color as she realizes what her employer has done. "Wait, Your Honor," Sarah begins, but Dr. Richardson gives her a subtle shake of the head. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." As she exits the courtroom, Dr. Richardson reflects on how many times in her career she's encountered men like Bennett, men so secure in their position they'd forgotten to question their own assumptions. The heavy doors swing shut behind her, leaving a courtroom filled with mounting tension, and one judge blissfully unaware of the storm about to break. The State Judiciary Conference bustles with activity in the Grand Meridian Hotel's ballroom. Crystal chandeliers catch the morning light, casting prismatic patterns across the sea of black robes and business suits below. Judge Michael Bennett arrives fashionably late, abandoning his barely touched morning coffee at the registration desk. "Michael," calls out Judge Harrison Peters, his old law school classmate, "heard you've been keeping busy in the suburban circuit. Still ruling with that iron fist of yours." He chuckles, clapping Bennett on the shoulder. Somebody has to maintain standards. Bennett responds with a self-satisfied smile. Just yesterday, I had to teach someone a lesson about emergency vehicle zones. You wouldn't believe the excuse she tried to. He stops mid-sentence. Through the crowd, he spots a familiar figure near the stage. The woman from his courtroom is arranging papers at the podium, dressed now in an impeccably tailored suit that somehow seems more appropriate in these surroundings than in his courtroom. Must be part of the support staff, he mutters to himself, though something nags at the back of his mind. Her posture, her confidence, it all reads differently here. Bennett. Governor Mitchell's booming voice cuts through his thoughts. He turns, ready to engage in the kind of networking that's advanced his career, but freezes when he sees the governor heading straight for the woman at the podium. Dr. Richardson, the governor says, loud enough for nearby conversations to halt. Your keynote on judicial bias is exactly what our state needs right now. When you proposed these undercover courthouse evaluations 4 years ago, I knew you'd revolutionize our system. The blood drains from Bennett's face as the pieces click into place. Next to him, Judge Peters inhales sharply. Michael, he whispers, isn't that Chief Justice Richardson? The youngest Chief Justice in state history. Bennett's world tilts sideways. He watches, helpless, as more dignitaries approach the podium. The State Attorney General greets her warmly. The Bar Association president engages her in animated conversation. Each interaction drives home the magnitude of his mistake. Did you say something about teaching her a lesson? Peters asks, unable to keep the mix of horror and amusement from his voice. Other judges nearby turn to listen, their expressions ranging from shock to schadenfreude. The conference director approaches the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're honored to begin today's session with our Chief Justice, Dr. Samantha Richardson, speaking on implicit bias in the justice system. A view from both sides of the bench. Bennett's legs carry him automatically to his assigned seat, in the front row. A cruel twist of fate, or perhaps deliberate placement. He sinks into the chair, hyper-aware of the whispers spreading through the room. His colleague Judge Martinez leans over from the next seat. Rough day to be you, Mike, she murmurs. I heard through the grapevine she's been conducting anonymous courthouse evaluations. Something about seeing how justice is really served when judges don't know who's watching. The room falls silent as Dr. Richardson takes the podium. She commands the space effortlessly, her presence radiating the authority Bennett had so completely missed, or chosen to ignore, in his courtroom. Her eyes sweep the audience, pausing briefly on him. Distinguished colleagues, she begins, her voice carrying the same measured tone she'd used in his courtroom, though now it resonates differently. Today, we're going to discuss how unconscious bias shapes our judicial system, drawing from real examples I've encountered during my courthouse evaluations. Bennett's collar feels too tight. He fights the urge to loosen his bow tie as she continues. In fact, just yesterday, I had an enlightening experience that perfectly illustrates our topic. She pauses, allowing the tension to build. Bennett shrinks in his seat, aware of hundreds of eyes darting between him and the podium. The morning sun streams through the ballroom's high windows, illuminating Dr. Richardson like a spotlight. In this light, Bennett finally sees what he should have noticed yesterday. The unmistakable bearing of someone who had earned her authority rather than merely inherited it. Please welcome Chief Justice Dr. Samantha Richardson, booms the conference director's voice across the ballroom. The applause that follows feels like thunder in Bennett's ears, each clap driving home the magnitude of his error. From his front row seat, Bennett watches as Dr. Richardson arranges her materials with the same deliberate care she'd shown in his courtroom. Only now, the leather portfolio she opens reveals not a checkbook, but the speech that will unravel his carefully maintained worldview. 20 years ago, she begins, her voice carrying easily through the hushed room. I stood before a judge who took one look at me and decided he knew my story. Today, I still encounter judges who believe they can determine someone's worth, intelligence, or truthfulness based on their preconceptions. Bennett's colleague, Judge Martinez, shoots him a knowing glance. His hands, folded in his lap, have grown cold with sweat. Just yesterday, Dr. Richardson continues, making eye contact with various members of the audience, but conspicuously skipping over Bennett, I parked briefly in an emergency zone while delivering critical medication to a child at Children's Memorial Hospital. The attending nurse had called, frantic, saying the child's condition was deteriorating. A murmur ripples through the crowd. Bennett feels the weight of dozens of eyes on the back of his neck. When I appeared in court to explain the situation, I was interrupted 3 times. She pauses, letting the words hang in the air. The judge, who will remain unnamed, never looked at the hospital's supporting documentation, never read the security log showing I'd properly registered my vehicle, never allowed me to complete a single sentence of explanation. The projector screen behind her illuminates with statistics, racial disparities in sentencing, patterns in judicial interruptions, correlations between defendants' appearances and fine amounts. Each data point feels like a personal indictment to Bennett. But this isn't about one judge. Dr. Richardson says, though the subtle emphasis she places on one makes Bennett flinch. This is about patterns of behavior so deeply ingrained that we often fail to recognize them in ourselves. When I began our undercover courthouse evaluation program, I wasn't looking to catch anyone in the act of overt discrimination. I was seeking to understand how justice is served when judges believe no one of consequence is watching. The room temperature seems to drop several degrees. Bennett recalls every dismissive gesture, every interruption, every assumption he'd made yesterday. His bow tie feels like it's choking him. The judge yesterday, she continues, her voice taking on a thoughtful tone, fined me the maximum amount, suggesting that people like me needed to learn about civic responsibility. She allows herself a small smile. The irony, of course, being that civic responsibility is quite literally my life's work. Scattered nervous laughter ripples through the audience. Someone behind Bennett whispers, "Did he really say that to the Chief Justice?" But here's the crucial point. Dr. Richardson leans forward slightly, her presence commanding complete attention. That judge isn't unique. His actions weren't extraordinary. They were, in fact, perfectly ordinary. And that's precisely what should concern us all. The presentation moves on to concrete examples of bias in the justice system, but Bennett barely registers them. His mind is stuck in a loop, replaying every interaction from yesterday. The way he'd dismissed her professional title, the assumptions he'd made about her character, the satisfaction he'd felt in teaching her a lesson. From the corner of his eye, he notices Sarah Chen, his clerk, slipping into the back of the ballroom. Their eyes meet briefly, and he reads both sympathy and disappointment in her expression. She tried to warn him, he realizes, had seen what he'd been too arrogant to notice. The path forward, Dr. Richardson's voice cuts through his spiral of self-recrimination, requires us to acknowledge our biases, to recognize that none of us is immune to prejudice. Only then can we begin the real work of ensuring equal justice under law. The words hit Bennett like physical blows. In the harsh light of the conference ballroom, surrounded by his peers, he finally sees himself as others must see him. And the view is far from the image of judicial wisdom he'd cultivated for so long. Instead of the public humiliation Bennett expects, Dr. Richardson's presentation takes an unexpected turn. Her laser-focused gaze sweeps the room, commanding attention with the same quiet authority she displayed in his courtroom. Only now he understands its source. "Let me tell you about a judge I encountered early in my career," she begins, stepping away from the podium. "He looked at me, a young black lawyer fresh from Harvard, and said, 'The cleaning staff uses the back entrance, miss.' That judge later became one of my strongest allies in reforming our judicial system." The tension in the room shifts. Bennett, still shrinking in his front row seat, feels the weight of stares lifting slightly from his shoulders. "You see," she continues, pacing thoughtfully across the stage, "bias isn't a terminal diagnosis. It's a starting point for growth. When that judge realized his mistake, he didn't just apologize. He asked questions. He listened. He changed. Her words hang in the air as she clicks to the next slide. A graph showing dramatic improvements in judicial equity metrics over the past decade. This is what happens when we confront our biases head-on. When we're willing to acknowledge our blind spots, we create space for real justice to flourish. In the third row, Bennett notices Judge Martinez nodding. She'd faced her own battles as the first Latina judge in their district. He remembers his dismissive comments when she was appointed, comments he'd considered concerns about qualifications. Yesterday, Dr. Richardson says, her voice taking on a more personal tone, I experienced something that perfectly illustrates both our challenges and our opportunities. Bennett's heart races, but she doesn't look his way. A judge dismissed my explanation about delivering emergency medication to a child's hospital room. He assumed I was making excuses. He told me that certain people need structure. The room collectively holds its breath. Bennett feels sweat trickling down his back. Now I could name this judge. I could make an example of him. She pauses, letting the possibility settle. But that would be missing the point entirely. Because yesterday's interaction wasn't about one judge or one case. It was about the systemic patterns that shape our justice system. She clicks to another slide, showing statistics about interruption rates in courtrooms based on race and gender. When that judge interrupted me 3 times in 2 minutes, he wasn't doing anything unusual. When he assumed my explanation was an excuse, he was following a pattern so deeply ingrained, he probably didn't even notice it. Sarah Chen, still standing at the back of the room, catches Bennett's eye again. How many times had he interrupted her case summaries? How often had he dismissed her insights with a wave of his hand? The beauty of recognizing these patterns, Dr. Richardson continues, her voice warming, is that once we see them, we can change them. Every interaction becomes an opportunity for growth. Every mistake, when acknowledged, becomes a stepping stone toward better justice. She returns to the podium, her expression thoughtful. That judge from my early career. He now runs implicit bias training sessions for new appointees. The court clerk who once directed me to the defendant's bench instead of the prosecutor's table. She's now a diversity coordinator for the state bar. The message is clear. Redemption is possible, but it requires honest self-reflection and genuine change. So yes, I experienced bias in a courtroom yesterday, she concludes, looking directly at Bennett for the first time since beginning her speech. But what matters isn't that single interaction. What matters is what happens next. What matters is how we choose to grow from these moments of truth. As applause fills the room, Bennett remains seated, his mind racing. He thinks of every defendant he's dismissed, every explanation he's interrupted, every assumption he's made. For the first time in his career, he sees his tough but fair reputation from the other side of the bench. Dr. Richardson gathers her materials, accepting congratulations from approaching colleagues. Her presentation has offered him something he never expected. Not just a lesson in humility, but a path forward. The question now is whether he's brave enough to take it. Judge Bennett sits in his parked car outside the courthouse long after the conference has ended. The setting sun paints the building's stone facade in shades of amber and shadow, a sight he's seen countless times but never truly noticed. His bow tie hangs loose around his neck, a physical manifestation of his unraveling certainty. Computer, cancel all appointments for tomorrow, he says into his phone, his voice rough with emotion. His mind keeps replaying fragments of Dr. Richardson's presentation, each memory cutting deeper than the last. Instead of driving home, he finds himself steering toward Children's Memorial Hospital. The emergency zone where Dr. Richardson had parked comes into view, a simple stretch of curb that had seemed so black and white yesterday. Now, he watches as a mother rushes out with a child in her arms, a nurse hurrying to help them into a waiting car. All these years, he mutters to himself, all these cases. He pulls into the hospital parking lot, killing the engine. Through the windshield, he can see the emergency entrance where Dr. Richardson had delivered that critical medication. A security guard stands nearby. The same one who would have logged her vehicle, created the documentation he never bothered to read. His phone buzzes. A text from Sarah Chen. Judge Bennett, I've pulled the last 5 years of our case files for review, focusing on sentencing patterns. They're on your desk whenever you're ready. He closes his eyes, remembering how often he'd dismissed her subtle attempts to point out disparities in his rulings. The night deepens around his car, but Bennett barely notices. His mind travels back through hundreds of cases, thousands of decisions. The young Hispanic mother he'd fined heavily for a traffic violation, ignoring her explanation about rushing her sick child to this very hospital. The black college student he lectured about responsibility when she tried to explain why she'd missed a court date. Her father's funeral, he now recalls with shame. Your Honor, she'd said, tears in her eyes, I have the funeral program here. The court's time is valuable. He'd interrupted, just as he'd interrupted Dr. Richardson. Bennett pulls out his laptop, opens his case management system. With trembling fingers, he begins searching through his past rulings. Patterns emerge, stark and undeniable, in the blue glow of the screen. The data tells a story he'd refused to see. Higher fines for minorities, longer speaking times allowed for white defendants, interrupted explanations correlating perfectly with race and gender. His phone buzzes again. Judge Martinez. Mike, when you're ready to talk, I've got some resources that might help. Being there. It's not about shame. It's about growth. A young doctor hurries past his car, her white coat catching the streetlight. For a moment, he sees Dr. Richardson as she must have been 20 years ago. Brilliant, capable, yet facing judges who couldn't see past their own preconceptions. What have I done? He whispers to the empty car. He starts the engine but doesn't head home. Instead, he drives through the city, seeing it with new eyes. Past the community college where so many of his defendants took night classes, the schedule conflicts he'd never considered. Through neighborhoods where a simple traffic stop could mean choosing between paying rent or paying his fines. Near midnight, he finds himself back at the courthouse. The building looms dark and silent, but light spills from one second-floor window, his chambers. Sarah is still there, organizing those case files. Bennett parks, straightens his bow tie out of habit, then deliberately loosens it again. 27 steps to his courtroom, but tonight each one feels like a mile. The portraits of past judges watch his slow progress down the corridor. Had they ever faced moments like this? Had they ever chosen to change? At his chamber door, he pauses. Sarah looks up from a mountain of files, her expression careful, waiting. We have work to do, he says quietly. The night stretches ahead, full of hard truths and harder questions. But for the first time in his career, Judge Michael Bennett is ready to listen. 3 months later, the morning sun streams through the courthouse windows, catching the dust motes in its golden beams. Judge Bennett's chambers look different now. The imposing oak desk has been replaced with a round conference table, the stern portraits giving way to community artwork. A framed quote from Dr. Richardson's speech holds pride of place. Justice isn't about authority. It's about understanding. Sarah Chen enters with the day's docket, no longer walking on eggshells. First case is interesting, she says, settling into what's now her usual seat at the table. Single mother, 3 missed payments on traffic fines. She's submitted documentation about recent hospital bills. Have we verified the hardship claim? Bennett asks, adjusting his bow tie. A habit that survived his transformation, though the stern expression that once accompanied it has softened. Already done, Sarah nods. I've also prepared information about our new payment plan program. The morning unfolds differently than it would have 3 months ago. Bennett listens, really listens, to each case. When a young black lawyer stumbles slightly in her first court appearance, he sees Dr. Richardson in his mind's eye and offers the same patience he'd want extended to his own daughter. During the lunch recess, he finalizes his letter to the Chief Justice. The 5th draft sits before him, each word carefully chosen. Dear Dr. Richardson, Your lesson in humility has become a catalyst for change. In the past 3 months, we've implemented mandatory implicit bias training for all courthouse staff. We've established a community advisory board to review our sentencing patterns. Most importantly, we've started listening. Our new payment plan program has reduced default rates by 60%. Our modified scheduling system accommodates working parents and students. Every decision now passes through a simple filter. Am I serving justice, or am I serving assumptions? But perhaps the most significant change is personal. I no longer see defendants as cases to be processed, but as people to be heard. Each interaction is an opportunity to either reinforce or challenge my biases. I choose to challenge them. Your grace in handling my misconduct taught me more than any punishment could have. You showed me that true authority comes not from demanding respect, but from extending it. With genuine gratitude, Judge Michael Bennett. As he seals the envelope, his computer chimes with an email notification. The subject line makes his heart skip. Courthouse Evaluation Follow-up, Office of the Chief Justice. He opens it with slightly trembling fingers. Dear Judge Bennett, your latest case statistics just crossed my desk. The changes in your courtroom's equity metrics are remarkable. More importantly, the letters from community members speak to a fundamental shift in how justice is experienced in your jurisdiction. Growth begins when privilege confronts itself. Welcome to the journey, Michael. I'll be conducting another evaluation next month. This time, I look forward to experiencing your courtroom as it should be, a place where justice and understanding meet. Best regards, Dr. Samantha Richardson, Chief Justice. Bennett reads the email twice, then looks up at the transformed chamber around him. The afternoon sun catches the community artwork, creating a warm glow that seems to affirm his path forward. Sarah appears in the doorway. Judge, your 2 o'clock is ready. Young man, traffic violation. Says he was rushing his grandmother to dialysis. Documentation. Bennett asks, standing. Already verified with the clinic. Sarah responds with a small smile. Times have changed. As Bennett walks the 27 steps to his courtroom, a journey he still counts but now uses as a moment for mindfulness rather than authority. He reflects on how far he's come. The weight of his robe feels different now. Less like armor, more like a reminder of responsibility. All rise, calls the bailiff, but Bennett quickly motions for everyone to sit. This is a court of justice, he says, his voice carrying the warmth of hard-earned wisdom. And justice begins with being heard.